Did you know that Cabernet Sauvignon has had a bunch of children? Although, a little like Tom Cruise, the children of Cabernet are not quite as fond of the limelight as their dad. So we have assumed the role of wine paparazzi in order to bring you some of the juicy goss on Cabernet's lesser known offspring cultivars. Probably the most famous of Cabernet's children is Marselan, which is a result of the crossing between Cabernet Sauvignon and Grenache Noir, and this was first done in France in 1961. In South Africa, there's only one estate that bottles a 100% Marselan, and that is Waverly Hills Estate in the wine district of Tilburg. Roux Cabernet is another child of the king, and it was produced out of a crossing between Cabernet Sauvignon and the Spanish grape of Carignan. It was bred by the famed viticulturalist Harold Olmo, who was something of a grape breeding legend during his tenure at UC Davis in California. Now, probably the weirdest of all Cabernet's children is that of Cabernet Blanc. Cabernet Blanc is a white cultivar that was born out of the hybridization between two red cultivars, Cabernet Sauvignon, and a grape called Regent, which is grown in Germany and Switzerland. And I guess this goes to show that sometimes two weds can make a white. The word Cabernet is supposed to have come from the Latin caput nigrum, which then got kind of mangled by the local Mid-Arc dialect of the day into Cabernet. It essentially means black vine. Sauvignon comes from the French word sauvage, which translates as wild, and it's from this word sauvage that English speakers have inherited the word savage. So Sauvignon Blanc can be translated as wild white vine, and Cabernet Sauvignon can be translated as wild black vine. But of course, with this newfound knowledge, that makes the name of Cabernet Blanc something of a conundrum, because it essentially translates as the white black vine. Then again, I suppose that doesn't make any less sense than Blanc de Noir. Now, the focus on Cabernet Sauvignon's obscure children was in part triggered by the fact that today's hand drink solo wine of the day is a Cabernet Sauvignon, which was produced by the estate of Zorgvliet in one of Stellenbosch's higher lying wards, Banghoek. Now, Banghoek is very close to Helshoogte, which translates to the heights of hell. And as is so often the case in real life, the heights of hell are populated by some incredible South African rock stars, producers like Takara, Thelema, De Leergraaf, and Capensa van Fynbosch. Zorgvliet as an estate has been owned by the van der Merwe family since 2002. So it was entrepreneur Johannes van der Merwe who was then heavily involved in gold mining, but wanted to buy Zorgvliet in order to not only increase its capacity, but increase its quality and to focus very much on the top end of the wine quality scale. As a result of these efforts, over the last 20 years or so, Zorgvliet has had an almost uninterrupted representation in the gold medal category of wine competitions like the National Wine Challenge or of Wine Mag's Bordeaux Cultivar Report. In fact, sometimes their single cultivar wines like Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon have even outshone their flagship Bordeaux blends like the Rochelle. Zorgvliet's cellar master is a man called Bernhard, and when we take a look at his CV, we see very quickly why he was chosen in order to lead a winemaking team that would focus exclusively on Bordeaux cultivars. Bernhard has worked with some truly monumental wine brands around the world, and these include Villefonte, which is a Paarl-based winery in South Africa, but was recently named Best Red Wine Brand in the World by the IWSC. And at Villefonte, he worked alongside the world-famous viticulturalist Zelma Long, who was also the co-owner of Opus One in Oakville, California. And speaking of California, Bernhard also worked under Bo Barrett at Chateau Montelena. And in case that wasn't enough, the list of local greats that he's worked with is also incredible. He worked under Franz Smit at Spear. He worked under Kevin Grant when Kevin Grant was at Hamilton Russell. And finally, more recently, he worked with Miles Mossop at Takara. But just because you rub shoulders with the fancies, that doesn't necessarily mean that you know how to make great wine. So let's get into the glass and assess Bernhard's work for ourselves. When we give it a sniff, well, we get a fairly classic Stellenbosch Cabernet nose. Although admittedly, classic Stellenbosch Cabernet has a spectrum. On the far right, you've got vivid fruit forward, and on the far left, you've got surly, savory herbal. So bearing that in mind, I would say that Zorgvliet's Cabernet Sauvignon sits just a little left of center. The aromas are a lovely mix of blackcurrant, some dried thyme, even a deeper hint of fennel, and then oak-derived notes of vanilla bark and a touch of cedar. When we take a sip, well, it's the structure that strikes first, both with regards to concentration and tannins. The fruit is really tightly wound, ready to spring, which it does as it opens up beautifully in the glass. Around that fruit, then, there is the framework of some really quite firm tannins, but they manage to be firm without being rough. So in a sense, it's like you've got a powdered chalk in your mouth as opposed to sucking on a tea bag. The sensations are quite different. But don't take my word for it, compare the two for yourself. And if you need the fruit basket flavor notes approach in order to make sense of the wine, well, the notes we get were mostly on the nose, but they are things like blackcurrant, a little touch of fennel, even some tobacco, and then a lovely savory finish that features those dried herbs we spoke about earlier. When it comes to discussing how the wine was made, there's nothing too crazy out there, but there are one or two very clever winemaking techniques that Bernhard employs, which I can appreciate. Firstly, Bernhard makes heavy use of racking. Now, racking is essentially letting the wine settle in a tank and then draining it out of that tank, but leaving behind those solid gross lees and other things that have settled out of the fermenting wine. Bernhard will do this multiple times in the process. Now, each time he does this, it dramatically improves the clarity of the wine. And when the clarity is improved, you reduce the need for any sort of aggressive filtering, because that aggressive filtering can remove some lovely levels of color and flavor that belong in the wine. The cost of this process, of course, is that it takes far longer to get to that desired level of clarity. The second element that I really appreciate about Bernhard's approach, and one would hope that this would be standard practice across the industry, is that he ferments all the parcels of fruit for this wine separately. Then when it comes time to mature these parcels of fruit in barrels, only the most concentrated parcels of wine get new oak. This is so that the power of the fruit is matched by the stronger influence of new oak. So when he moves on to perhaps lighter, more aromatic parcels, those will get definitely older oak and also larger barrels, again so that the fruit intensity, or lack of, is matched to the slightly lower influence of older oak. It's pure common sense, and yet it's not something that everybody gets right. Overall, the wine spends 20 months in oak, of which only 20% is new. Okay, so that's all we have time for today, but if you have any questions about Bernhard or Banghoek or Cabernet Sauvignon, then drop a comment on the site and I will get back to you as soon as possible. And if you enjoyed the video, then support us on Patreon and subscribe to the Hendrik Solo YouTube channel, where we publish at least 6 videos each month talking about things like wine science, wine history, unusual cultivars, and some of the rising winemaking stars that are coming out of the dynamic South African wine.